Morning, the topic that we are going to discuss is the components of ecosystem.
Objectives. Determine the functional components of ecosystem. Illustrate the structure of ecosystem. Differentiate the abiotic and abiotic factors.
First, what is ecosystem? Eco means habitat and system means complex set of interconnected components or a process of forming into a whole. So the definition of ecosystem is a chain of interaction between the organisms and the environment where the plants, animals, and other organisms will work together to form a bubble of life. So the examples of ecosystem is forest, aquatic ecosystem, marine ecosystem, and coral reefs. Next, the concept of ecosystem according to Oxford ecologist Sir Arthur Tansley, who first introduced the term ecosystem in 1935 in describing how biotic and abiotic aspect of the environment interact at a specific location. He coined the term ecosystem to recognize the integration of the biotic community and its physical environment as a fundamental unit of ecology within a hierarchy of physical system that span the range from atom to universe. So, we have also our characteristic of ecosystem. First is linked with other ecosystem, which refers to connected into a large biome. No ecosystem exists alone. They are interconnected via output and input that act as a link. For example, a river may receive many inputs from terrestrial ecosystem through which it flows. Second, structural complexity. It is the physical structure of an ecosystem which a presence of distinctive interacting habitats within the ecosystem like mangroves, sea, and grass beds. The third one is the resilience. It innate the capacity to adapt to different perturbations and to sustain essential functions. But the degree of resilience depends on the intensity of the stress to which ecosystem is exposed. The last one is the dynamic stability, which ecosystem always undergo changes and are termed as a dynamic system. We have our types of ecosystem, the natural and artificial ecosystem. Natural ecosystem is a community of living and non-living things, entities, and occurs freely in nature. We have our two types of ecosystem. We have our two types of natural ecosystem, which is terrestrial and aquatic. In terrestrial ecosystem, it is a land-based community of organisms and the interaction of biotic and abiotic components in a given area. Example of terrestrial ecosystem are the tundra, grasslands, deserts, and forest. In aquatic ecosystem, it includes oceans, lakes, rivers, streams, and wetlands. Within this aquatic ecosystem, all living things that depend on the water for survival, such as fish, plants, and other microorganisms. This type of ecosystem are fragile and can be easily disturbed by pollution. The second type of ecosystem is artificial ecosystem, which a man-made structure of biotic and abiotic components that are made to interact with each other for survival. It is not a self-sustaining and can perish without human help. Example of this artificial ecosystem includes aquariums, agricultural fields, and zoos.
Good day everyone, this is my task to discuss the structures of the ecosystem. These are abiotic component and biotic components. Under abiotic components are climatic factor and edaphic factor. Under biotic components are producer, consumer, and carnivores. So let us go beyond on the two structure of the ecosystem. Let us first define what is abiotic components. Abiotic components is a non-physical chemical elements in the ecosystem. So it means that it is non-living, it is chair, bags, and etc. While biotic components are living organisms that shapes the environment. These are human, animals, and etc. that is breathing. Abiotic components composed of four structures. These are climatic factor, edaphic factor, organic elements, and inorganic elements. So climatic factor, it includes light, temperature, water, wind, and fire. So example for this is the photosynthesis. If the place is too low in its temperature, then the photosynthesis is affected. So next is edaphic factor. These properties affect the diversity of organism or living organism in the soil and the environment. So example for this is if the soil is unhealthy, then the food couldn't provide a healthy food too. So organic elements are the substances such as water, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. So inorganic elements that are together bonds with chemical compound. So let us move on to biotic components. So biotic components has three structures. These are producer, consumer, and the decomposer. Producer use light and energy to synthesize their own food. Example, plants and green algae and etc. So without the producer, all living organisms don't exist. So consumer is considered as heterotrophs. There are three types of consumer: the primary, secondary, and the third. So primary consumer usually eats plants only. These are birds, mice, and worms. Secondary consumer organism that eats primary consumer are meat eaters. So human and animals are considered as the secondary consumer because we eat sometimes bird, worms, and mice if it is clean. So the third consumer, it eats both primary and the secondary consumer. So transformer and the decomposer is considered as heterotrophs, comprises the entire such as fungi or bacteria which breaks down the dead plants and the animal's matter and return into a form of nutrients used by producers. So a decomposer is its big factor on how the ecosystem happens because it serves as or it gives us nutrients. So the picture shows about how food chain affect the ecosystem. The food chain diagram, the producer to consumer. For example, plant, worm, birds, decomposer. It breaks down to the top predator to start new food chain. Two types of food chain. These are grazing food chain and the detritus food chain. A grazing food chain is a chain usually larger compared to the detritus food chain. Releases energy into the ecosystem, helps in adding energy obtained directly from the sun, while the detritus food chain is usually smaller compared to grazing food chain. It utilizes energy from the ecosystem, helps fixing inorganic nutrients obtained directly from inorganic debris.
The food web. Food web illustrates the flow of energy through interactions in the ecosystem. All the food chains in a single ecosystem make up a food web. Each organism in an ecosystem is a link in a number of food chains, and energy and nutrients can go along different food chains as they move through the ecosystem. A food web is made up of all the linked and overlapping food chains in an ecosystem. All species in the food webs can be distinguished into basal species or autotrophs, intermediate species or herbivores, and intermediate level carnivores, and top predators or high level carnivores. Those feeding groups are referred as trophic levels. The first trophic level is the producers, also known as the autotrophs. They make their own food and do not depend on any other organisms for nutrition. Most autotrophs use a process called photosynthesis to create food like nutrient called glucose from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. For example, plants, which is the most common autotrophs or primary producer. The next trophic level are made up of animals that eat producers. These organisms are called consumers. Consumers might be omnivores or carnivores, or animals that consume other animals and animals that eat both plants and animals. Like humans, omnivores eat a variety of foods. People consume plant foods like fruits and vegetables. We consume meat, milk, and other animal products as well as eggs. We consume fungus like mushrooms. Additionally, humans consume algae found in edible seaweeds like nori, which is used to make sushi rolls, and sea lettuce used in salads. Bears are also omnivores. They consume fish and deer as well as the berries and mushrooms. The second trophic level is the primary consumers, which are the herbivores, animals that eat plants. They are at trophic level 2. Deer, mice, and even elephants are herbivores in an ecosystem of grassland. They consume trees, shrubs, and grasses. A mouse that consumes seeds and fruits is the main consumer in a desert ecosystem. Numerous fish and turtle species in an ocean ecosystem are herbivores that consume algae and seagrass. Giant kelp is a type of seaweed supports a complete ecosystem in kelp forest by offering shelter and food. In kelp forest, sea urchins are significant primary consumers. Each day, these tiny herbivores consume several pounds of enormous kelp. Herbivores are consumed by secondaries. At the third trophic level, they are a snake that consumes a mouse, maybe a secondary consumer in a desert ecosystem. Sea otters are secondary consumers that consume sea urchins in a kelp forest. Secondary consumers are eaten by tertiary consumers. At the fourth trophic level, they are an owl or an eagle may feed on a snake in an ecosystem of the desert. Top predators or apex predators or top predators consume other consumers. They could be at trophic level 4 or 5. Except for people, they have no natural adversaries. The top predators in the ecology of grassland are lions. Fish like the great white sharks are the top predators in the water. Mountain lions and bobcats are the predators in the deserts. The difference between food chain and food web is that who eats whom is described in a food chain. All of the food chains in an ecosystem make into a food web. Food chain has single linear pathway of energy flow, is a single unit, and may consist of 4 to 6 trophic levels. Whereas, food web has a number of interconnected pathways through which an energy flow within an ecosystem, has a collection of several interconnected food chains, and may consist of numerous trophic levels. Unlike food chain, food web, when there is a disturbance to a single organism, it does not disturb the whole food web. Ecological succession. Ecological succession is the progressive change that occurs in a species through time as a result of the environment. Considering that all biotic elements must adapt to changes in our environment, this change is both foreseeable and inevitable. The completion of this process will bring the ecosystem to balance. A climax community is the one that succeeds in achieving this goal. The endpoint of succession in the context of a specific climate and geography is a climax community. An ecological setting where plants or animals populations are stable and coexist in harmony with one another and their surroundings. The last stage of succession is a climax community, which lasts until it is destroyed by an occurrence like a fire or human intervention. There are two major types of ecological succession, which is the primary and secondary succession. In primary succession, living organisms first occupy subsurface or newly created rock. In secondary succession, a previously inhabited region is disrupted, and then recolonized as a result of the disturbance. The primary succession, when a new piece of land is produced or is first exposed, primary succession occurs. This may occur, for instance, when lava solidifies and forms new rocks, or when a glacier recedes and reveals bare rocks. In the initial succession, organisms have to start over. First, lichens may cling to rocks, followed by a few small plants capable of surviving without much soil. Eventually, the decomposition of those plants aids in the creation of soil, and new and larger plants starts to occupy the region. They are known as pioneer species. Once sufficient soil has accumulated and sufficient nutrients are accessible, a climax community such as a forest is created. In the event that the site is disturbed after this, secondary succession takes place, or in the event that the primary ecosystem is lost, secondary succession occurs. The secondary succession. When a climax community or an intermediate community is affected by a disturbance, secondary succession occurs. The succession cycle is restarted, but not to the start because the soil and nutrients are still there. For instance, following a forest fire that destroys all the adult trees in a certain terrain, grasses may develop, then shrubs and other tree species until ultimately the pre-fire community is once more present.
In continuation of Ms. Cindy Gradada's report, so the next is the main functions of the components of the ecosystem: productivity, decomposition, energy flow, nutrient cycle, and homeostasis. So first was the productivity. The productivity of an ecosystem refers to the rate of production, the amount of organic matter accumulated in any unit of time. So productivity has three types, in which those green plants fix solar energy and accumulate it in organic forms as chemical energy. There are three types of productivity: the primary productivity, the secondary productivity, and the net productivity. The gross primary productivity and the net primary productivity. So in primary productivity, it is where the energy is stored for photosynthetic and chemosynthetic activity. In gross primary productivity, organic matter was used for respiration. In the net primary productivity, it is where anorganic matter was utilized by plants during measurement. Next is the second productivity. It is the rate of energy storage at consumer level. So in this type, it is where the energy was stored for the consumer. And next was the net productivity, the rate of storage of organic matter not used by the consumers. In this type of productivity, it is where the energy stored was not used by the consumer. The next component was the decomposition. Decomposition is the breakdown of raw organic material to a finished compost. So decomposition is a process by which dead plants and animals are decomposed and turns organic raw materials for plants to grow. There are also two types of decomposition: the aerobic decomposition and anaerobic decomposition. Aerobic decomposition has oxygen, in which organic materials decompose in the presence of oxygen. So example of aerobic decomposition is where droppings from trees and animals are converted into a relatively stable humus. Anaerobic decomposition is without oxygen. Anaerobic decomposition is the decomposition of organic mads at the bottom of marshes and in buried organic materials to which oxygen does not have access. Anaerobic decomposition takes place in nature as it is the decomposition of organic mads. The next component was the energy flow. Energy flow is to maintain the ecological balance where the producer synthesizes food by the process of photosynthesis. So energy flow is important as it is the controller to maintain the ecological balance. The next component was the nutrient cycle. The nutrient cycle is a system where the energy and matter are transferred between living organisms and non-living parts of the environment. So in nutrient cycle, it is where the transferred energy in both living and non-living organisms. The nutrient cycle includes the biochemical cycle. The chemical elements including all the essential elements of protoplasm, from environment to organism and back to the environment. The process of biochemical cycles consists of 6 examples: the hydrological cycle, carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle. First is the hydrological cycle. Hydrological cycle is the most important cycle as it involved the interchange of water between the Earth's surface and the atmosphere. Carbon cycle, it is where the carbon is exchanged among the biosphere, geosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. Next is the oxygen cycle. Oxygen cycle, it is where the plants release oxygen during photosynthesis. Next is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle is also an important element in which reduced and oxidized forms are involved. Next is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycle is necessary constituent of photoplasm to circulate the organic compound. The last is the sulfur cycle. Sulfur cycle moves through the rocks, water bodies, and living systems. The last component was the homeostasis. Homeostasis is the ability of ecological system to maintain stable system properties despite perturbations. Ecosystem homeostasis is equilibrium, or the balance of the organisms in an ecosystem. Homeostasis denotes the maintenance or the regulation of vital internal variables in a state of relatively constancy. The receptor, the control center, and the effector. Receptor receive information on the changing environment. Control center process the information received by the receptor. The role of effector is to respond the signal from the control center. That's all. Thank you.